Buenos días a todos y todas. Gracias por acompañarnos en el día de hoy. Mi nombre es Stephanie López, soy consultora en temas de políticas migratorias. Hoy me complace estar acompañada en este evento de mujeres venezolanas, colombianas y también tenemos una invitada ecuatoriana hoy que trabajan en pro de la inclusión de las mujeres migrantes desde sus diferentes trabajos, desde sus diferentes lugares. Como sabemos, Venezuela atraviesa hoy una compleja crisis humanitaria con inestabilidad política y social que ha expulsado alrededor de 6,2 millones de ciudadanos de su país durante la última década. El aumento de flujo migratorio hacia Colombia de personas provenientes de Venezuela ha generado un brote de xenofobia, aporofobia y discriminación. Este fenómeno se constituye como una amenaza para la democracia. La población migrante hoy en día está expuesta no solo a la discriminación y a la violación de sus derechos, sino también a la xenofobia y en algunos casos incluso a la violencia. Las mujeres migrantes representan un grupo con especial vulnerabilidad. Esto se debe a su posición de interseccionalidad entre, por una parte, su condición de migrante y, por otra parte, su condición de mujer. Un ejemplo de esto es que entre el 2017 y el 2019 hubo un feminicidio de una mujer venezolana en Colombia cada 11,5 días.
Every 1.5 days, a Venezuelan woman was killed in Colombia. And the precarious situation, xenophobia has augmented. This discrimination and xenophobia against migrating persons is shown in the streets, in digital platforms, social media, and communication, mass communication media. And they're like a soundboard for xenophobia, for fake news, and hate. Today, in this event organized by being, they need to work in English, where we're going to be talking about the challenges posed to Venezuelan women in Colombia and strategies that they use to surpass these challenges and obstacles. We want to discuss the potential benefits and contributions of Venezuelan people in Colombia. Our panelists will delve deeply into the situation of Venezuelan women. And in the case of Ecuador, we'll talk about the implemented solutions, and we'll be hearing from testimonies from leaders, women leaders that participate in an incident school for women, and we'll have the pleasure of having them here today. In order to today, I'll have to pass the microphone to Helen Debster. It's a fellow from Center for Global Development and from the initiative Let Them Work. Carry on, Helen.
Mucho gusto, Stephanie.
Morning, Helen.
So if you want to turn over your interpretation, that would be great. And if we could get the first slide up, that would be helpful. Thank you. So thank you to everybody for joining us here today. It's wonderful to see so many of you here, and I'm very excited for our discussion. I wanted today to start by setting the scene. As many of you will know, the vast majority of the world's 29 million refugees and forced migrants live in low and middle income countries. And in general, these countries severely restrict the rights of these people to work, move, and thrive. People are stuck, often for 5 or 10 years, without the ability to make a living for themselves and their families. Such a policy also means less economic productivity for the host country, fewer tax revenues, less social integration, and lower incomes and living standards for both the migrants themselves and their host populations. Of course, many people, both in host communities and policymakers, are worried about the impacts of allowing migrants to work, move, and thrive. So to try and unpick some of these pros and cons, we've embarked on an initiative which we call Let Them Work. Next slide, please. The initiative is funded by the IKEA Foundation and the Western Union Foundation, It aims to generate evidence on the impacts of expanding labour market access and develop policy recommendations for both global and national actors. So there is a lot of text on this slide, but you can see that it has three main pillars. So the first pillar is our global research and learning pillar. It aims to generate new data to answer some of the questions that are top of mind for policymakers and the public. Things like, does granting refugees the right to work reduce host community support for those refugees, or reduce the amount of money that those refugees will receive from the international community? The second is our country level pillar. So we're working in 4 countries, Colombia and Peru, Kenya and Ethiopia, to try and understand the barriers that refugees and migrants face in engaging with the labour market, the impact of these barriers, and the factors that have led to these policies. And finally, our third pillar is our work with the private sector. Businesses operating in refugee hosting countries are incredibly important. They can hire refugees, support refugee-owned businesses, provide financing, and promote the positive benefits of engaging with refugees. But often these businesses are left out of policy discussions or don't have the information they need to make the business case for policy changes. We hope to provide these businesses with this information so that they can push for progress. Last slide, please. So what have we done in Colombia? So in October 2020, after a year of research, interviews, and field visits, we published our big case study, From Displacement to Development: How Colombia Can Transform Venezuelan Displacement into Shared Growth. It provided an overview of the skills and experience that Venezuelans in Colombia have, the barriers that they face to full inclusion in the labour market, and how much benefit could be gained by everybody if these barriers were removed. We then wanted to go one step further to see if we could actively work on overcoming some of these barriers. So with the support of the Western Union Foundation, we joined up with El Derecho to identify those barriers that were specific to women and work with female leaders to overcome them. Today, we published the result of this work, and you'll hear some of the findings today. We are planning to continue our initiative for the next 3 years, working on issues such as financial inclusion, gender, climate change, and social cohesion. We are very keen to stay engaged with all of you going forward, so please do not hesitate to get in contact with me or Stephanie or head to our website. So I very much look forward to the discussion today. Many thanks again to all of you for being here. Back to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Helen. Gracias. Ahora vamos a continuar con las palabras.
Thank you, Helen. We'll be hearing from Alejandro Dali. He is a director of the right not to obey. Carry on, Edward.
Gracias, Helen, y todas las personas que se
Thank you, Alejandro, Stephanie, and to all persons that are connected for us. It's impression. A big work to be part of the alliance and to be collectively working for the interaction for the Venezuelan, especially of the migrant women in Venezuelan migrants. I'll share my screen and you can see it perfectly. Yes. So I'll tell you this is the platform of the right of now. We want to transform realities. One of those realities is xenophobia. From 2018, we are working with this several projects. It's your flag is my flag to integrate migrant workers, and in different cities of Colombia and Latin America. Throughout these 4 years, we have been 115 through conversation campaigns, events, integration processes, and so on. And after all these processes, we realized one thing that is in the case of Colombia, this is very important. We knew all the organization that were led by women working for integration, but we realized that most of them were the leaders were migrant women. After doing this analysis, after the Center of Global Development, so we gather what we can do to improve the potential of these women within their territories to face the barriers those barriers that do not let them work or participate actively in their within the so that's where the your flag is my far is the we are working with this these organizations. Objective is to qualify the capacities and the participation and citizenship incidents of the women leaders in Bogota, Cali, and Cucuta, and next, we'll be covering Medellin. This one. As such, from in this school, we gave classes to Colombian and Venezuelan women. Will be hearing testimonies, and we'll be hearing testimonies from these women. We decided that after knowing of the ecosystem, that the reality lived by this women will be these formative moments will be divided in migration and care institution of democratic institution in Colombia, transferring of the theory of the change, not the right not to wait, so as to raise more support. We had 6 weeks of class, and these were the results. 60 experts, 16 women, that is, came to class and bolstered their capacities. In Cali, we have seen women that Afro women, adult women, people displaced by armed conflict. We advocated that was fundamental to generate spaces of care for women in between adult or more elder or young women as well. For them of them, we did public events so they could explore and we prepare a web page constellation, and we could see the throughout this process the citizens were they advocated to how to uh, face the barriers in Colombia, Bogota, Cucuta, Cali, and this came along with and this proof of the power of women to transform the integration processes to at the social level. One other thing that we'll be talking about today is we did a policy report around the barriers for pregnant women. These policy reports, we made it in alliance to the Center for Global Development, and for the public eye will be reporting on the findings of our investigation. Thank you very much. Thank you. Gracias, Alejandro.
Después de este preámbulo, darle
Thank
la
you.
palabra
After this preamble, I would like to pass the microphone to Julio Dale, to Barómetro de Xenofobia and co-author of the policy paper that will be presenting. I'll pass in to Julio. Carry on.
Muchas gracias, Stephanie, y a todos y a todas por participar en este evento. Primero, aclarar que esta presentación le iba a hacer Olivia.
First, I want to clear up that Lydia was going to make this presentation, but she's very ill and can't do it. She's one of the co-authors and was at the head of this initiative. We hope you get well soon. Let's start the presentation, please.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. As has been mentioned, we are very excited to present the results of our investigations, which is overcoming the obstacles and inclusion for participation of Venezuelan women in Colombia. And used to happen in the context of massive migration that was mentioned at the beginning, Venezuelan migrating to Colombia, about a million that entered Colombia, and was characterized by prioritization of the Colombian government trying to promote the social integration through different types of tools, as are the special permit to stay and the protection statute. There's been a big effort from the institutions as well as the government, as well as from other groups, to integrate this population. Still, we know, and I will go into detail in a bit, that inclusion, the economic inclusion, is still limited. And we see that that limitation is particular, especially to women migrants from Venezuela. So the importance of this study lies on that there are various studies in Colombia that documented the differences insofar as jobs for men and women, insofar as the fact that women from Venezuela who are working here get less than half of the salary that Colombian women receive, and also the harassment that the women are suffering, the Venezuelan women. There were certain studies that show this type of problems, but we didn't have enough information. We didn't know what the particular obstacles were that this particular population was confronting, and especially what do migrant women do to overcome them? Besides, we know that they were overcoming these barriers, but we had no idea what tools or mechanisms they were using in order to do that. Together with that, something we thought was very important, the lack of knowledge and the role that was being exerted by the migrant women in the integration of the complete population. We will see further on that they're at the head of the integration effort. In order to generate information and contribute to the debate, we were motivated. We felt motivated to do this study, to perform the study. Concretely speaking, we wanted to look at the barriers to inclusion, both economic and social, of the women, and to identify what will allow them to overcome them. We performed 22 interviews with leader women, some of them with the school that Alejandro mentioned, and 67 leader women between Venezuelan, Colombian, and international. The principal results are that in order to overcome multiple obstacles, women use community and virtual networks, which are created mostly by themselves in order to find jobs, get information on migratory policies, and access services. Besides that, migrant leaders, especially women, they have a critical role. They create the networks and they keep them up. They give out information to the migrant community. They not only do they spread it, but they actually produce it and process it. They give services to fill the gaps between what the government gives and what they can receive, and without enough recognition or support. To be able to do these, we had 1-hour interviews with 22 leader women and 67 women. There were leaders, those who give services to migrants, and those who work around the migratory subject. They were performed between May and October of 2022. In the first table, you can see the amount of women that were interviewed according to the nationalities. And we made an effort to perform them in different cities, especially Bogotá, Cali, and Cúcuta. Now I would like to present the different barriers that we found to then show how they overcome them and then the opportunities. A principal one that was recurring in the interviews was gender violence. We found it with two basic ideas that are interrelated. On the one hand, the difficulties to be able to go to the courts, the lack of information for these that is available to these populations, how they can go to the police, and then there's a lack of resources to assist these women. There's here a quote from one of the women that we interviewed. The complexities, together with the lack of disposition on the side of some people in authority, makes this barrier a very important one, especially on women. The authorities tell her that if she cannot press charges unless the wounds are deep enough for them to be obvious and internalized. The second one has to do with stereotypes and discrimination. We see that there are stereotypes, prejudices that are widespread in the community towards migrants in general, especially in particular towards women migrants. And these stereotypes go around hypersexualization, as they are stereotyped as prostitutes, or an sexuality is out of control and can be problematic in the labor arena. Other barriers have to do with different cultural norms, like the accent, the tone of voice, the patterns of dealing with clients. These differences can complicate social and economic relationships between the groups. Another very important barrier has to do with domestic roles. This is not a surprise, but we found it very interesting how recurring it was in the interviews. Migrant women affirmed that the burden of the home falls on their backs, and they do not have the same type of support networks that they had in Venezuela, because either they're still in Venezuela or migrated somewhere else. So it makes it more difficult for them to be responsible for home tasks as well as integrating themselves into the labor market. Besides the obstacles, the three main obstacles, there are others, general ones for inclusion, that all of the migrant population suffers. Then because of the examples that we just saw, affect the women even more. We have problems around documentation, the PEP, the regularization, the legalization, paperwork, diplomas, the cost of performing these activities, and the lack of understanding that was there around this type of documentation. Even though the government has tried to minimize it, it's still prevalent. Many institutions will not accept the PEP as a valid document. Besides that, we see that there are problems that intensified with the pandemic in order to access formal employment. The pandemic affected all populations, but it had a stronger or deeper repercussion in migrant women that climbed to 34% from 29% that was there in 2019 for the migrant women after the pandemic. And on top of that, Wait, before, one more thing here. There's one difficulty to denounce labor exploitation that become real in differentiated payments for these women. They get paid less and they get more hours. They say that employers take advantage of their vulnerability and their desperation for a job. And that way because of that, they get paid with a lesser salary. And when they present documents that support them, even having the right documentation, they still get paid less and they don't know how to present the case and where to go. How do women overcome these obstacles? We see that principally the work in the informal sector is a provisionary measure. It allows women to start working and to begin to get some kind of remuneration for their job, but they remain in a precarious situation and it's very unstable. And to find other jobs and to find out about services and benefits, women use existent networks. And these are usually created by women migrants. And they are linked to associations that are informal and physical arenas like social networks. We see that they use Facebook, WhatsApp to inform each other, to keep up to date as much as possible, and to create the network that allow them to overcome obstacles, but especially getting a job, help each other, and connect with other members of the community. Now, one of the most important findings is the important role that migrant women have. The biggest role is integration. As I said at the beginning, migrant women help migrants to understand the Colombian wherewithal. They understand the documentation around health and labor markets, and then they communicate this to the rest. They advise the migrants and give them direct support of some things like food and shelter to the migrants. Here there are examples that we found in our interviews in health, where migrants closed the voids of services within the communities, in education, where many migrants started providing these services or closing the gaps for them. We consider that this role of being at the head of the integration of the migrant community is something that has not had or has not been documented or informed enough, especially when the women are victim to all of the barriers that I expressed early on in the presentation. The next one, please. The next slide. Okay, here there's a summary of the ideas that I have presented to you, the barriers that women have to overcome, and that they use networks and that women specifically have a very important leadership role in the diminishing of the gaps of public services, and they give services to the migrants and assisting migrants to helping them to find jobs. With all of this information, next please,
we made several recommendations for the government of Colombia and to other organizations that work with migrants, and summarizing those recommendations. I invite you to read them in detail afterwards, and you can see them in detail. So you read the document that will be publishing after we finish the presentation, both in English and Spanish. The recommendations to the government of Colombia were to fortify the support to institutional at the level of government agencies, including the prosecutions, work with Venezuelan and Colombian governments on political and policy, and to avoid labor exploitation through the Ministry of Work, and inform Venezuelan women of their labor rights. Gave information as to gender violence. Give more information to the private sector about the hiring of Venezuelan women, especially with a temporary protection. Give help to facilitate the obtain of diplomas. And the recommendation to donors and organizations, NGOs, internationals, and banks include give support and prioritize the generation of revenues to Venezuelan government to the local and community levels, support programs that respond to the promise of gender violence, and support programs that work with the prevention of xenophobia and violence against migrant women. Thank you very much for this space. If you have any questions, or would you like to delve deeper in any of those matters, write to the authors of this investigation, and Olivia, Stephanie, Maria Alejandra, and me. Thank you, Stephanie, and you all for this space. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would have to thank Maria Alejandra and the technical mission, Maria Calera Hernandez, Maria Victoria Gonzalez, for all the work and the support they gave us during this investigation. And again, to thank the Center for Global Development and the team of the right not to wait, and for their help in this investigation. I will have to pass the microphone to Paula Penteler from the team de Derecho de no conocer, no obedecer. Carry on, Paula. Thank you to you all. I invite Irene and Luis so that they turn on their cameras. Will be we have to we'll like them to tell the story. That's why they're here today. I would like to present briefly. We are with Luis Antonella, who is a migrant woman who participated in the school for the incidents of your flag is my flag in Bogota. Irene Sanchez is here. Is a migrant woman who participated in the school in the city of Cobra in Clarifilot, who is a women that participate in the school in Cali. And there are women that from several standpoints, experiences, they have considered, have thought deeply in what are the barriers, what are the possibilities for the inclusion of their stories, and they're going to working on increasing their stance for leadership. I would like to ask Eloise so that he tells about her story. Eloise? I think Eloise is having technical documents. If we can carry on with just Clary. Good morning, Paula. Good morning. How are you? Just Filot? I'm fine, thank you. I'm fine. Good morning to you all. My name is Yolega Filot. I'm Venezuelan. I arrived in 2018. One moment, please. I arrived in 2018 on December after 3 months, having been arrived to Cali. uh, I I became pregnant, and the issue of being a migrant would be very difficult. There were more xenophobia because I didn't have the special permit to permits. The cell system was, decreasing for Venezuelans. It was just they were taking care of, pregnant women, but it was difficult for me after 3 months after I gave birth. We got in, into the pandemic. It was difficult. It was very difficult. We had a little girl. I didn't have a job. Well, it was an obstacle that we surpassed, thank God. And we came across Alianza Solidaria, and I got information, on all the immigration matter. I enrolled with the University of El Valle. Uh, I learned, about gender violence, and I got empowered. After that was finished, the, the organization for women, I joined. I finally joined the after joined. Then I did a project with the Carvajal Foundation, and I work with Tu Bandera es Bandera, and I enroll in, in every other course that the group offer. I realized that those groups, mm, what we're doing, what we're planning for women, for migrants with those documents. So what did I do? I called with persons of those foundation. I can get persons for you. You can enroll them so they can plan. So they told me, include them, send me the information for them. This is what I'm doing because I'm a mother, and then the issue of being a mother and being a migrant is very limiting at the time, to get where I don't have any family here. And when I wanted to get a job, I didn't have any of trust that could, take care of my daughter. Uh, That hasn't allowed me to, I mean, I try to, I've been selling candy from my country, and I have made ends meet. That so I have informed myself, from him, all things that are placed for migrants for, you know, if whether you have documents or not, you can get some Medicare. How can you enroll in the health system, with the PPT system and so on. I try to help migrants or also Colombians as well. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes, Clary. Eloise is already. Eloise will pass the floor to you. Good day. Thank you. And hi to you all. My name is Eloise Infante. I'm an attorney. I am 26 years old, and I graduated from Carabobo University. I've been working for 4 years. Well, I especially the first 2 years when I arrived to Bogota, they were very difficult. The integration in the aspect, the labor aspect was very complex. You know, I was victim of sexual violence and looking for a job. Unfortunately, but as of today, Mm, thanks to the multiples, to the USAID and others, especially in my case, USAID activated another foundation. Mm, I am here today. That's been has been more than a year in this house. That has allowed me to surpass uh, the prejudices in regards to migration, especially against women, against hypersexuality, and all the facts brought about by our colleague before. During his presentation today, I feel I am a spokesperson of a person of things that we can make it. That I am calling you to calling for you to support integration, migration. As give help to persons that flee their country, that just looking to uh, get thrive. You know, go or in those countries that they had to leave, whether they wanted or not. Thank you for sharing your testimony, Eloise. I would like to pass the word to Irene.
Irene, estás con el micrófono cerrado, no te estamos escuchando.
Good morning. My name is Irene Sanchez. I'm 36 years old. I arrived in Cacucuta in 2019. It was, a hard year. There's some people when arriving here for want to get a lease. Not everybody leases an apartment or a house to us. From this year on, it's been a process to have access to health, to schools. I have 3 kids. This year is it was something harsh. After the when with the pandemic, things got a little bit more difficult, and that's when I started to think in all places. There's NGOs and foundation, but I didn't know about anything. In 2020, I didn't know about anything. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know where to get information. So that's what gave me the curiosity to look for help, where to go. Little by little, through WhatsApp works and through social media, I got information. I got got to know many things that I didn't know. After that, I managed to see the community, that there were persons, migrant persons here, that they didn't know where to go. So we started to a journey to for help with an NGO, and through that I started to have more communication with uh, other persons that live here in the war, who they were, to get to know where they were from. Sometimes they didn't know where to go, and when I had investigated, I gave that information. I oriented them. So little by little, I I managed to give them impulse to be a leader. It grew within me, and I like this. It's something that how could I explain this to you? Without me wanting to get something, I like to help and I like to share. And up to this day, I have been trying to always give information as to person as to where to go, how to get health uh, services, how to talk at a school so that they can them enroll them the kids in school to get education, and channeling workshops, seminars, and so on.
Muchísimas gracias, Irene.
Thank you very much, Irene. So I think it's been, we're flattered that you share, what you were telling us in the socialization of the investigation roles, how the role of women during the migration process takes a fundamental process, and the stories of Irene, Eloise, and Yoshari. In adversity, uh, their response was to get organized, get collective solutions, find different possibilities to make things better. So they are telling us about the barriers, but also the possibility of women to promote to be themselves, to be
dentro de quienes promovemos la integración, dentro de
so
quienes
for those that we promote
promovemos
integration,
posibilidades
so we are
para la inserción laboral, para la
working
gestión
for
de
inclusion and
figuras
for social inclusion, no
significa ser una mujer
protection of rights, you know, productive and otherwise, and how to be a productive woman in Colombia. So I'll pass uh, in Colombia, I'll pass the floor to Stephanie,
And to thank
and I
Eloise,
think
Irene,
just
and
Claire.
Clary, not just for their participation, but also for all of the work that they've been doing. Participation in La Escuelita, and to continue being part of this great network, working for the cultural integration of migrants in Colombia. Thank you, Paula. I want to say thank you to Josclari, Eloise, Irene, for your testimonies, but also for all women that participated in this study. But more than even beyond that, as them, there are many women that are examples of leadership within their communities. And this study is geared to allowing us to support them better in overcoming these barriers, and so that their inclusion is better in society. And I'm very happy to hear, as usual, and I've said this beyond, that you work together with Colombian women in order to overcome some of these barriers that are not exclusive of nationality, but they're more gender exclusive. Having said this, I would like to hand it over to the conversation panel with three important. We have Ana Aguilera from the World Bank. Ana has been with us for more than 10 years in international development with consultantships, multilateral organizations. She's specialized in supporting analytical and operation support in migratory movements and forced displacements and economic support. She is in charge of making the agenda for migration more robust within Latin America and Central America. She's worked with various governments in Latin America. She is an economist from Andrés Bello University in Caracas. She has a master from the University of Chicago and from the University of Maryland and Michigan in statistics and that type of work. Thank you, Stephanie. We're also, Joconda Herrera is also here, professor of sociology and gender studies in Ecuador from 1999. She's been studying effects of globalization over inequities and social aspects from the feminist perspective. She has analyzed migratory processes to Europe and the United States, especially women and indigenous populations. She's studying the forced return of the indigenous population in Ecuador and the impact on their families and the relationship with this indigenous community. And she's also working with the forced migration analysis in the Andean countries, especially Venezuelan and so on, and the state's response to this type of migration. Welcome, Gioconda. Thank you, Stephanie. Good morning to everybody. Finally, we have Carolina Morena. She's a lawyer from Andes University and has a master's in public policy. She works in the University of Los Andes in the law department and directs the migratory studies and Derecho, Migración and Acción Social network. She works with this in University of Los Andes. She's focused on administration, public policy, internal displacement, clinical, legal, education. That has been her centers of study. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank all three for having accepted our invitation to come and talk about this. More than that, more beyond being able to talk about the results of the study that we just showed you, I would like us to talk about some questions that are very punctual and some maybe more general concerning the barriers of the migrant women's barriers to the labor market. I would like to ask, what are those barriers that have been identified in Latin America for women workers? Thank you, Stephanie. A pleasure to be here with you. The first thing I would say, as in other places, mobility has to do with exclusion risks, not just in the labor market, but human trafficking, harassment, and so on. And we see it in the Ukraine every day. But it also happens in Latin America. When there's migration in transit, that's when they're the most vulnerable, especially women and girls, to be harassed and to suffer gender violence because they have very precarious labor conditions. They're not at home, and their migratory conditions puts them in an even higher level of vulnerability than other women or men. We have supported some impact studies in Colombia, Peru, Ecuador on migration. And recently, we're giving technical assistance to Chile, Dominican Republic, and so on. So systematizing these lessons learned, we found 4 basic barriers that I'm very happy to say are very in line with the study that was presented by you. These 4 types of barriers, I would separate them in 4 blocks. First, regulatory barriers that they block. The second block, which is full participation in society and the labor markets. The third, perception barriers. And the fourth one, discrimination barriers and gender violence. So I would put those 4 big blocks. The first one, which is regulatory, I would say that the lack of documentation and the situation of being in an irregular status heightens this type of vulnerability in women in Latin America. In other places like Spain, where there's also a lot of Venezuelan migration. Why? Because you're in a country that's not yours. Maybe you left with papers from your couple, from a partner. That puts you in a very different level within the home and the society. So there is a lack of or a de-representation of women in the formal sector. So in Ecuador, almost half the women work in the informal sector, while only 1/3 of men do, of the migrants do. Okay, so there are a lot more. So it's not just the informality in work, but also in housing, as you said, it was education, telephone services. So you can't even open a bank account. So you depend on somebody else to open the bank account or get you a phone card, or you don't get rental. So this generates invisibility of the person, and it reinforces the vulnerability and that sense of not having control over your own life, and that you depend on others in order to have a dignified life. In the second block, all of this regulatory problem and lack of access to identity papers, so it blocks them from full participation in society and in the work market. For example, they stop people from getting the kids into school. When you cannot take them to school, then you can't work either. So that's something we learned from the pandemic. And it was also quite useful in understanding the type of barriers women face. And the World Trade Organization in Dominican Republic looked at Venezuelan population. It showed that 61% of all migrants are women that are unemployed, and those that are informally employed, 56%. In Colombia, it's similar, but especially for the lower educational level, 53 of every 100 of unemployed are women. And the participation rate in the labor market is 23, 26%. The unemployment rate in migrant women is a lot higher than men. And I'm sure that Carolina and we'll talk about this. But curiously enough, in Colombia, the situation flips for women who are highly qualified in general. In Colombia, women who are highly qualified and have a higher education level usually have a higher participation in the labor market. Employers prefer to hire women in higher levels of education. Of the Venezuelans in Colombia, there's a preference in hiring those who have higher studies, postgraduates, and so on. And migrant women in Colombia usually have higher levels of affiliation to the Social Security, tax and non-tax based, because many of them have dependents. In Ecuador, 53% of the girls and adolescents are not in school, of the migrant girls, the Venezuelan migrant girls. The two main reasons are lack of documents, so we go back to the regularization one, or the need to work in order to provide. So this is added to the social norms in which women, migrant or not, in Latin America, assume the responsibility of the home, of the children, taking care of children and elderly. In Latin America, 3 out of 4 professionals in the health and education are women. Of all of them, 22 work in the social sector. And this is important because there's a differentiation in roles. In Colombia, for example, a DANE study shows that there's a clear difference between the women as head of household and women as the one who comes. And this translates not just in the home, but in the type of jobs. So they work in things like serving jobs. Men work in manufacturing, construction, agriculture, women as maids, and so on. And this has an impact in fomenting the participation of women as something different from an added value. And I will be done in a couple minutes. The third is the perception topic. In Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, you see the perception that Julio mentioned of stereotypes. And the migration has exacerbated them, saying, for example, Venezuelan women are prostitutes, according to this perception. The people that were polled thought that the majority thought that most of the women would end up as prostitutes. In Peru, there's a perception that Venezuelan women steal husbands, which is a very difficult accusation in a country where getting a husband is vital to guarantee your way of life. So we've had many cases there where there's xenophobia against women, against women, and we've got interventions like radionovelas and things like that. When the perception translates into action, this is the fourth block, then we have discrimination and violence, gender violence. In Ecuador, for example, Venezuelan women work on an average 1 more day a week than the men, but they earn 30% less. And in Dominican Republic, they also earn less than men, 28% less, and 10% less than other women in other social sectors. They also have challenges in order to climb in their careers, access to health, even if you have the law saying that you have universal access. The discrimination against them translates into 1 out of 4 women that do not have access to health. They say that they have trouble just getting an appointment, something that Ecuadorian women do not say. In Ecuador, especially, we could say all of Latin America, because women face 3 main types of harassment and gender violence and harassment. They have it at work, in schools, and in the home. Migrant women report high rates of sexual harassment. We've heard about that. Then gender violence at home. That's accentuated when you have no papers, because then I cannot accuse someone because I'm afraid of being deported back to Venezuela. So that was even worse during the pandemic. In fact, for every 3 months that people were in quarantine or pandemic, we had 15 million more women who were probably exposed to gender violence at home. And in schools, we have very high teen pregnancy rates and sexually and STDs in adolescents. So we had a higher percentage in migrants as opposed to the local population. The good news is that regularization is a very important tool against these barriers. Investigations from the World Bank show that just being able to get the special protective status brought down just having that paper decrease the incidence. From 2021, the World Bank supported the government with financing and technical support to give these permits. We continue to give technical assistance and do studies in order to integrate migrant women in all of Latin America. Thank you. Thank you for your reflections. Thank you.
As a matter of fact, some of these reflections were very interesting, and we should delve deeper into those. Against the migrant. Before passing the microphone to Yoconda, and I'm glad that we touch upon several matters now in Ecuador, and we'd like to hear from her work. I'd like to tell the persons that are listening to you, if you have any questions, you can write those questions in the chat. We'll be passing some numbers in regards to health and in regards to all the barriers found or encountered by women in Ecuador. I would like to ask you, what are the greatest risks for women in Ecuador, and what resources there are, which resources they mobilize to overcome these barriers? Yes, thank you, Stephanie. Anna presented a picture, a photograph of the situation of the worst discrimination against women, Venezuelan women in the labor market, gender violence, and the lack of access to the unequal access in terms of social protection. I would like to to this picture and put some, give it some process, from the standpoint of a qualitative investigation, that, after we get that photography of the inequalities, what we did is look into, well, what's the process in which these women could, with the differences, between women and men in the labor market, Ecuadorian women residents, and upon looking up on the trajectory on the labor market, we found that the population, the Venezuelan population, the migrant population, is very mobile. There's a lot of mobility of cities. We have found that in Ecuador, as opposed to other migrant groups. Women have trajectories, they're very unstable in the market, the labor market. They get paid less, and this comes from a permanent change in work. That trajectory, those are unstable. Short-term work, temporary work, many jobs and changes in their jobs, and that gets you to precariation for several reasons. Employers are benefited from having temporary, and the change is more intense. This, of course, it's, it makes the precarization deeper. Another characteristic, looking at the processes, and that was mentioned, work jobs for Venezuelan working are in the area of service, selling stuff in stores, in hairdressers, in the section domestic works. In Ecuador, this type of work normally are normally for should belong to the formal economy, but there's an informalization into the formal businesses. And it's not selling stuff on the street on informal works that we know about, but there's this hiring in case of women of the informal into the formal, and we encountered that during study. And this means you're at a job that you should be receiving benefits, you should be receiving minimum salary, and your health services should be covered, but other workers have access, but you are not allowed to have it. There's a barrier there because you don't have any papers, because it would be cheaper to employers to not to affiliate you to social security and not to pay you for the benefits. It's there's that interplay of of getting a job, getting a formal into the formal and so forth. And another thing another barrier that I would like to mention, which derives from this photograph, is that we know, and it is accentuated in the Ecuadorian case, the processes of being overqualified, of women, the overqualification of women in the labor market, the educational levels of Venezuelan of of in several labor niche. Venezuela women are better prepared, and the studies, the qualification for studies, but and this overqualifying process could be transformed in disqualification. And I think that's something that we need to look into. That happened to Ecuadorian that went to Europe, that is maybe a teacher, it's, I mean, if they move to Europe as an accountant, after 10 years, it's no longer a teacher, it's not an accountant. The permanence of overqualified women in jobs that do not require that qualification end up, turning into of disqualification as well. This is a barrier as well. It's almost invisible, which is very important, which we need to think about and what to do. That in the labor department, if you will, in regards to sexual harassment at work and socialization, which is a present characteristic which has been mentioned. I would like to mention Mariam Barito. The work of Mariam Barito is a colleague, attorney, Venezuelan attorney. There's a relation between xenophobia, uh, and so she found the and sexualization, that sexualization and the relationship with xenophobia is very it's been articulated through aporophobia. Not all Venezuelan women are sexualized or have been harassed, but they're represented by the people in need of poor, which will do anything because she needs to uh, provide food for there's a relation with aporophobia, xenophobia, and sexualization. That's something that we need to look into as a barrier. The representation is not only about sexualization, but it's also the poor women without you know things in the imagination who is is fleeing a destroyed country. There's some myths represented in this body of that woman, and that takes to a look of victimization as well. We need to look into that. Besides xenophobia built upon that, the women that have been migrating, it's as explicit violence. It is, but also it is there's an implicit violence as well of victimization, of to take away, this poor ladies, will do anything that's buried, that Venezuelan women will, express that with force and fury. They did not want to be placed within that mold of a victim of a destroyed country, of a et cetera, that cannot face it. So that as a second point. Oh, and the third point, in regards to, gender balance, what would be the paths to respond to this? There are some exits that we can, that would be collective and individual exits as well. I'll start with the latter because of the educational level of many women and their search for of information to try to get information as to her situation and find what we found. Several cases. We have some complaints at the Ministry of Work, not so much as sexual harassment at work, but no payment. That not not it's not that the state, the Ministry of Work, reacts. It starts a process with the employer, but it's rather a negotiation process. If you don't pay, but I have, the complaint of you need to pay me, or I'll, file a complaint. So there are individual things of women, empower women that have been able to surpass in, and the collective ones in work, and the colleagues in Colombia have found of networks, the use of networks, of TICs, it's fundamental. It's they're very good at that. So as to allow the care. I'll sh shut up right now, but we need to have clear, you know, we have the fact that women not only are in charge of their families, migrant families, but they also have to take care. They send money to mothers, father, uh, daughters, son that have remained. Is not only territorial care, and I will leave it at that. For we can retake the subject later. So in on the basis of a job and of the work we have done.
I thought it was very interesting that various of the points that you touched upon, that was very similar to what we have found in this study. That is a much smaller scale, but very significant. Because that point that you touched upon of the re-victimization, precisely, we wanted to do this with leader women who are empowered, who are already doing things with their communities, and that are trying themselves to empower other women, precisely so there is no more re-victimization. I think it's also interesting that you mentioned exploitation. And I'm going to ask my the next panelist to talk about this, Lina Moreno. I would like to ask her, and retaking this topic, the work exploitation, labor exploitation, what are the main violations to Venezuelan women now coming to the Colombian environment that you have seen from the legal clinic from the University of Los Andes? What have you seen to be most common? And beyond that, Carolina, I would like to ask you, what mechanisms exist? And if they exist, why, as Yoconda says, and as we said in our study, why sometimes the women don't go to these mechanisms that exist? I would like you to tell us a little bit about this, focusing on the Colombian case specifically. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to hear Yoconda in this panel. So insofar as the legal things are not happening as we would wish. I will not be able to touch on everything. I'll talk about 4 points, answering Stephanie's question first. I see a pattern, and that is gender violence. And this is because it's a way of violence that happens and transversally in every female's life, transportation, in school, and their work, at home, wherever the women, migrant women are having their normal life, you will find different expressions of gender violence that then exacerbate the situation that is already a vulnerable one. This is very important to understand, because if we don't recognize this within our public policy, we won't be able to think about mechanisms and strategies to include migrant population in general, but specifically women migrants. From this point, I want to see that gender is important. Authorities need to have that and take it into account in order to address specific vulnerabilities that they have because they're women, and how that translates into the intersectionality with poverty, gender orientation, gender identity, sexual orientation, and so on. So it's not just one migrant woman. There are different projects and different stories of life, and they have to deal with different types of then gender violence. And it's important to have this into account in the design. So these elements of gender violence is going to translate into different scenarios and then impacts women all over the place. Second point, how we access justice. Of course, in Colombia and everywhere else, we have legal processes for people to make their labor laws or labor rights respected. And there are instances they can go to have that happen. But when you're a migrant, the first obstacle is that the judicial system doesn't recognize them. Even though Colombia has subscribed international instruments that say that migrant people and their families in Colombia have the protection independent of whether they are in a regular or regular status. In theory, it's great, but when the person gets thrown out of work or does not get paid, or a woman who ends up pregnant and has to leave and they receive no payment, she has no protection. The system does not have a special protection for this. For that is a barrier in the Constitutional Court on this. A Venezuelan migrant woman here in pandemic, she told her employer she was pregnant. She asked for a temporal license, and she was just left with no work, period. She was thrown out. How do we protect this woman? And in these courts, and the court found that when you have to file suit, is that the first thing that you're asked for is a document of identity. In Colombia, if it's not valid in Colombia, then you cannot even file a suit. We have the tutelage one that helps in this type of claim. It's very difficult, costly. We have limits in access, in legal advice. So again, poverty, on not knowing that you have the right. They say, oh, Since I don't have my situation is not resolved, I don't know that I actually have the right to work, or I have the right to be included in the social security system, in pensions. So when we don't know what my rights are, what our rights are, and how to make them valid, how to make people respect them, then that becomes part of a vicious cycle. When the labor market incorporates these people, they do so under the premise of I'm helping you, and I'm doing it because I'm a nice person. But it's not based on the fact that I have the duty of employing them and respecting certain rights, especially when someone has suffered an accident at work and they say, I need protection. And the first thing that happens is that they get thrown out, they get fired. So to these justice barriers, to know so that they can know what their rights are, you add that people are scared to interact with the authorities. That's another variable. How can we tell a migrant and that's irregular and is here working, for example, in Colombia, that they didn't have the requisites of being here? The question is, can I go to an authority that even though I entered here in an irregular way, can I do it? Yes, you can. But we know that there is a weight, a burden on the migrants where they fear deportation because they're in Colombia irregularly. So asking for help becomes the reason that you get deported is a problem. So again, there are disincentives that are very big and very, very much there that act against people being able to report this type of situation. Migrants regularization is important so that people can go and make their situation regular. And to think that regularizing them, inclusion comes automatically, it doesn't happen that way. Because as you have spoken about, you've spoken about the different groups of barriers that come into place. Because it's not just being here, is how can they be inserted within the Colombian society? Third point I want to mention has to do with social security, access, not just health. It's the most important one, and why many people from Venezuela have had to leave, because there is no health service. They are forced to leave because of that, but that's not the only one. I must be able to have a retirement, a pension, that if I have an accident at work, if I'm incapacitated, that there's a system that can provide that diminishing of my work capacity. Do I have what so that I can have the resources to live with? That has not been established. We're still trying to navigate the how to access health. So when you have a formal any kind of work contract, there has to be access to the social security, risk, health, and pensions. That's very important. Insofar as health, we have moved forward. Women in particular are still facing barriers in reproductive health. The access to abortions is a very new thing in our constitutional court. Up to being able to have an abortion up to week 24, especially the migrant women who are poor. How do they get to know this? They need to be protected. And because of this, the court also decided to depenalize abortions because they've said because they're women and they're migrants require special protection. When a woman has been the victim of sexual violence, then abortion is not just a right, but a medical urgency. So you cannot deny it to women. So women report them, and the first thing they get is who did it, why did you do it, why did you come, etc. So all of this happens without the system responding to them. We don't have a gender focus in attention to, and when we interact with women who have the bravery of reporting what has happened, then what they get is they get a stigmatization and more gender violence. And finally, in the work arena, there is no equality in treatment between nationals and migrants. Much less is there between women and men. And every day, the care element becomes more relevant. The incredible burden that migrant women have on their backs. In order for them to then, women, if you going out to look for work requires time. They have to take care of people. So they don't have the same kind of support network. So if you don't have someone to take care of your kids, you can't go out to get a job. So in order to work, you don't just need a capacity, studies, experience. It's not just that. It's having the time to go and find a job, go to an interview, go to a medical exam. All of that requires time. If you don't have the time to do it, you can't go out to get the job. So this is associated with the idea of, but why do you have so many kids? You have 3 and 4 kids. You've got kids all day. What's the problem? Why don't you have work? And so on and so forth. And this goes with the, oh, they're poor because they want to. Sexual rights and reproductive rights, these women are being barred from that. And this is something that we need to cover. I remember talking to some of them from Soacha, close to Bogota, and they commented, it's more expensive going to work as domestics because of the transportation and everything than the kind of remuneration they got. So then they had to also pay somebody to take care of their kids. So they would say working becomes more expensive than not working. And this is absurd. So it's a huge challenge. So an important step in this, in the migratory. So for migrants, especially women migrants, it's very important that these mechanisms are made accessible, that they have guarantees when their rights are violated. Thank you, Carolina. Very interesting. We had about 3 different visions from sociology, economy, and from the legal perspective. As politologist, I'm of course going to put I'm going to talk here about the gender focus, which is so important in our public policies. And the fact that we don't have a migratory policy, a robust one, we begin to see why we need to highlight this type of focus. And the actual migratory law is not quite there. I would like you to please stay a little bit longer so that we can ask you a question. And we have a question that I would like to make to Yoconda. We're being asked if individual negotiations with employers that doesn't pay justly to the women doesn't impact.
I'll give you a minute to all of you. So how do you believe the importance of citizen participation for the integration of migrant women in the receiving countries? I ask you, briefly where time is up. I'll give the floor to Yoconda and then to Carolina. Yoconda, Gary, very short. there's no relation. There's not that they change relation, but because they complain about payment. I want this to be a generalization. Would be an example to show that once they get the information, that they know that this possibility exists, they 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 go to that mechanism to as a negotiation mechanism as to instability. This has to do with this scenario of labor markets which are have been deteriorated, and the possibility from the standpoint of the employers that they pay to pay less. The specific case has to do with the offering of payment that had not been done. So the claim is that that person did not receive the payment, which is different to that other the situation. That doesn't derive into the other. It's necessary to disclose that information as to right possibility working, lodge complaints. And in the case of Ecuador, it's not in the constitution. There's no difference between migrants in terms of access and on the right to lodge a complaint. That's not generally told to the people, and people are in fear of lodging complaint. The challenge of in societies, the receiving countries, what we need in all the region, xenophobia is increasing. That's, it's about to living together. We need to work and has to how to work, live together. We need to work on that. If we have less, less xenophobic representation, less brash, responses with that population. Those persons have contact in their ward, in their neighborhoods, and in their houses with Venezuelan tended to be, to accept, have a living relation, rather than the others that, listen to what the media says. It's very, and I leave it like that. It's very important that we need to keep working, because we need to work on many other things that were not done because of the pandemic. Now we are listening to uh, Anna in regards to the participation of citizen in Latin America. Is one of the most violent places in the world against women. It's higher than the world average. We need to organize ourselves as any other group. Yeah. So I would say that citizen participation, we need to, we need to get social capital and networks. Have a colleague, a friend that brings information, how to enroll your kids, how to solve a harassment case, how to enroll your shooting in kids in school. We need to learn. They need to learn to get information, make a register, share that information, and 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 how to participate in public spaces. In the school council, the citizens council, and the municipal council, where we can make a statement as to our opinion. Try to have access to public employees, and once we need to go beyond the stereotype. We need to promote women that are an example to others. Break that image of victim, which is a risk factor, and to fortify the the imaginary, if you will, get rid of the imaginary thing that Venezuelan women are just victims. We need to do with that. I'll pass the word to Carolina. I would say that coming from from the standpoint of migrant women, they don't vote. Authorities and governments will pay attention to them, and in the election period, they use migrants to expose them to for xenophobia, and those places we don't like it. Having Achilles heel, what we can do fortify is to amplify the social instances that this to so that these persons get organized, have a voice and a channel of interaction with authorities. And this is very clear. We need to have a, a date with the president. You can do things at a local level with neighbors, get more information, uh, release that information, discuss this information, discuss this matter that are of interest on. We need to organize to share our experiences as to how the others' experience may help us or others, and that would be the base in the at the municipal base. It were very important that those channels, if grassroots from the grassroots up, so get that social strength. The policies, the politics, sent by the technocracy. That not if we think that university have all the knowledge that can and the public policy, but that public policy needs to you know be it's important that these structures, the refugees and when women be organized, and that the authorities interact with those women, and that they not construct the from up to the bottom. We in the context of migration, it's very complex and it's move. It's not from Bogota and from the capitals. It is not. You need to understand that a homogeneous solution will not. It would be plural, diverse, more active, and more from the grassroots and up. Thank you very much, Carolina, Yoconda, Ana, to the women that have participated in this. It's very important to retake this matter of governance at different levels. We talk about when we talk national, local, and in case of Venezuela, at the regional level needs to be. It hasn't really worked. It hasn't worked really well. Notwithstanding that there are spaces to do so. I would like, you know, say, as a final remark, that the necessity of having more investigation as to, Yoconda say, the the officiality of women, trying not to victimize them. The not that some of them, many of them are in power already. Is they're not only here to ask for handouts from the government, but also to give, and we're on the right path right now. From the Center for Global Development, we're informing the policies, and with the studies, what we want is to generate some incidents for policymakers, as stated by Carolina, that include directly as Carolina stated, needs to include the population that will benefited from those policies. I will invite you to consult the study that has been published in the webpage of the Center for Global Development. It's available in Spanish and English, and we hope that this is a contribution to fortifying the policies and the participation of Venezuelan women in Colombia, and also more so to make them visible, that work, which is not paid for. Thank you very much to you all. Thank you very much. See you soon.